The Shoebill Stork is my all-time favourite big bird, from the machine gun-like clacking sounds they make to the slightly intimidating death stare they can give. They are truly something special. Hi, I'm Kate Sculpts. Welcome or welcome back, for I have made yet another sculpture with a silly amount of detail for what it is, and it takes up too much of my time. Before I start working on the shoebill, I need to make the base, which I want to resemble the muddy, tall grass areas that the shoebill is most associated with. As I always do, I start off with a foil underbase, adding clay glue on top to make sure the clay sticks nicely. You wouldn't usually have much of a problem sticking clay to crumpled foil, but it tearing off is always a possibility, so I add clay glue to make sure that that doesn't happen. When I started this, I was under the assumption that the middle dipped section you'll see in just a moment was going to be layered with water made from resin, but in the end I didn't go through with it since I didn't want to take away from the main attraction, the shoebill. This means the middle is slightly dipped, and I painted it differently later on, but I think it works anyways as it creates a muddy look to it and also makes it so that the base isn't completely flat. I then make some stones to dot around in the mud and grass parts, and to do this I just generally make some rough shapes and texture them with lines and scratches. Small stones like pebbles are usually smoother, and larger ones have more texture and rougher edges, which is generally the rule that I used when making these big ones. I use clay glue to add them on, and also a little bit of extra clay just to blend them in so that they won't slide around. I also go in with this very tiny little detail tool and kind of scratch in this texture up on the banks, the sides of this area, which I then also manoeuvre onto the main grass parts in a slightly thicker section of texture. Making the smaller pebbles, like I said, will be rounder and generally smoother, but they still do need texture, so I just use a bit of foil to texture them. I keep them very populated around the edges of the banks here, surrounding bigger pebbles with a lot of smaller ones. Generally, the more that you add, the better it kinda looks. And then what I do next is I start making the little tufts of grass. There are two ways to do this, both using Cosclay so that it's bendable and won't snap after baking. The first way that I do it is placing a ball down, blending it in, and then kind of pinching it up into grass so that it has kind of a flared base, sticks to the ground very nicely, and also can be controlled very well. But it's quite difficult to get multiple into the same area, as you can kind of squish them by accident. So a different way to do it is to pre-make the long strand and then make sure that the base of it is bigger than the rest, so that when you blend it into the base, it will stick without the bottom getting too thin and then snapping off. I add quite a lot of them in kind of sections, like little groups, and then once I'm done with that I go and make a few more stones. These ones are going to be on the grassy sections, and out of all of them will be the biggest. The texturing on these is going to be kind of like lines scraped across with a few rougher bits. I think that generally kind of looks like stones. What you can do is just use a bit of foil and just kind of smash it into the clay and it'll make it look like stones, but I do quite like to do it manually sometimes like this. Then I just add it on, again using more clay to secure it, and then once I'm done with that, I then make something that I haven't quite done before, which is making like little bushy ferns. I start off with a line of Cosclay, and then I add these sections going off of them on each side, and then once I'm done with that I do blend them all together. I do need to blend both sides, and I think they look quite nice. The first time that I tried it, I tried cutting it out, a flat piece of clay, and kind of cutting each of the things in, but that didn't really look great. This looks much better. And I make them different sizes, some small, some big, and then I just attach them. Something you might notice is a lot of the bigger ones I place up against those stones that I've made. That's just to hold them up so that they don't snap, even if they are made of Cosclay, they still can. And just so that they're a bit more stable. The smaller ones I do allow to be standing up on their own though, without any stone support. I then texture the ground using this small ball tool, similar to how I usually do moss. If you've seen my other videos, you know how much I love moss, and I scrape it in. The next part is something I've been experimenting with, but pretty much I mix Cosclay with some liquid polymer clay to make a very sticky substance, and then using this tool I glob it onto an area, then lift it up to create little strands of grass. The downside is that they can't be closely populated. The upside is that it adds another bit of detail so the grass doesn't look as flat. Now that I am done with the base, I can finally work on the shoebill, starting with its head. At first I do make the beak way too large, which I fix by adding more clay around the rest of the head so it appears bigger. Unfortunately, I didn't use my big brain, so I forgot that making the head bigger would also mean that the rest of the body will have to be bigger too. In the end, the Shoebill is much larger than I intended just because of this little slip up, but hey, the bigger the better, right? I then used some cabochons, with one flat side being the side that I paint on, to make the eyes, with some little highlights, the pupil, the iris, etc. And then, once they're dried, I place them into their head, using a ball tool just to make the little recesses. As I usually do, I slipped up yet again and forgot that inside the head there is quite a lot of foil, so I couldn't press the eyes in as far as I wanted, which also gave me yet another reason aside from the beak to extend the clay on the rest of the head to make it a little bit bigger. I had a small section of extra clay to the middle of the beak to again try to recreate the big shoe-shaped bill, which of course is why this stork is named the Shoebill, and I'll come back to the beak in a little while. Next thing I do is make little feathers. This is just going to be a taste of the feathers you see later on, which I'm going to be doing for the wings. Pretty much they're just long feathers, and I cut out some little sections and also texture each side, making the lines on each side directional, so one going left, one going right, and then making a line down the middle which I can then place the bone line in. Making a bit of clay this thin, especially Cosclay, is difficult to say the least, but I managed it. Peeled it off the thing, and then once they're baked, because I'd like them to be hard so that they're not all squishy, I add them to the head, pressing them into the clay. I make about 7 of them in total, so 1 in the middle and then the rest are across the sides. But I do make them a little bit spread out, so I squish them in together later on. The final bit I need to do on the beak is add the line to separate the halves, and then I give a gentle texture on top. Although this texture doesn't seem like much now, I use this very gentle recesses to my advantage later on in the painting process. And then we're going to start on the part which is most excruciating but also very rewarding, the feathers. For the head feathers, they are going to be very small and round, so I make little balls, flatten them out on this acrylic pad, and then I texture them in these sort of directional lines. There are going to be 2 different types of feathers on the Shoebill, these ones which are the very small ones, and then the bigger ones which are going to be longer, have those cuts in them, and will have other sort of directional lines like left and right, like I was doing on the feathers for the back of the head. Then, to attach them, I have to use this tool because if I use my fingers, I will definitely squish them. So I do add them in layers as well, because of course the feathers are facing downwards, you have to start with the ones on the bottom so that you can layer it up all the way to the top. It is quite difficult kind of figuring out the different directions on the head because it does switch in certain areas, but in the end it's okay to figure out. I then bake the head so that I can start working on the main body. It was quite difficult to generally get the right shape as they're kind of leaning in a certain way, but in the end I used some extra clay just to bulk out certain areas to get it right. I then need to start making the feathers for the body. Now, like the head, they are still very small compared to the feathers like on the back and the wings, and on the tail too, but they still are big enough where I need to add these sort of sections and then also scrape them in directions, 2 sides, like I did for the ones on the back of the head. This is a similar concept to how I'm going to be doing them for the wings, but without the bone line down the middle. See how tiny they are? So difficult. I then take them off the base and start adding them. The ones on the back are bigger than the ones on the front. I do want the ones at the front to be kind of those small ones like I did on the head, and this was very difficult on my hands. I made hundreds of feathers to cover this entire thing, not including the wings or the tail, and yeah, it did start to take a toll on my hands, so, you know, if you're going to do this yourself, maybe consider making a mould of the feathers. Maybe that would be easier, but no, I'm stubborn. And then to do the chest, I don't really make the feathers like I did for the rest of them. I make them much thicker and don't add the little slits in them either. This is because I want the chest hair to look much fuzzier and fluffier, which after painting definitely does look like that, but right now it does kind of look a bit harsh. And again, they are in layers as well, going thinner up towards the head. I then bake the body and use my little drill to carve these sections out. Of course you can just mark these sections out before baking, but I wanted to do it after to save me the hassle. To add the clay on the legs, you can either use liquid clay under the clay so it sticks, or make the clay itself stickier by mixing in liquid clay. I want them to be as thin as possible except for their knees, so what I do when blending the clay together so that there's no seam is I do kind of drag it down and get it as thin as possible, and then add more clay for the knees, of course. Once I'm done with those, I kind of put them to the side for a moment to start working on the tail. Using Cosclay, like I've done before, which I will also do with the wings, I add a flat base first so that I can stick the feathers to it, and then I begin to make the feathers. These are the biggest ones I've made so far, but do not worry, the wing feathers are much larger. This is pretty much identical to how I'll be doing them on the wings, so I might as well just explain now. I carve out little triangles to mimic how actual feathers have little dips in them sometimes, and then I go and texture them in directions, going down kind of towards the tip, but not completely down and not completely horizontal either. Once I've made them all, I add them to this flat bit of clay, making sure that the bottom of these long feathers are all in line with each other. For the most part, it seems as if Shoebills have tails that have flatter bases to them and not slanted like some birds. I then just attach it to the body and then start to work on the legs after blending it in. I add the legs into those holes that I made and then add the thighs with some extra clay on top. This both holds the leg in place nicely and also creates the little bulge for the thighs, which I do texture slightly differently, as if it's fur and not feathers like the rest of the body. This is just to make it look a little bit different, and also if you look at a Shoebill, a lot of the time it does look like their legs kind of have softer fur to them. The knees are going to have slightly harsher, deeper lines in them, whereas the rest of the legs will be more delicate, partially because I don't want the detail to be too thick on anywhere other than the knees, but also due to the fact that the layer of clay over the metal wire is so thin that there is only a certain amount of detail it can hold before hitting the metal underneath. Once I finish texturing the legs, I do attach them to the base, and surprisingly, it stands. I was completely expecting it to just fall over and collapse. I didn't think it would be able to hold up its own weight, but I guess the metal wire extending deep into the base, unlike I usually do it where it's just kind of surface level, does really help to keep it held into the base. I make the little feet, or claws, whatever you want to call them, texturing them the same way as I did the legs, before moving on to the wings. I will admit, making the feathers, as horrible as it was on my hands, was really relaxing, making just repetitive forms, as for hours I could just zone out and make them one by one. In hindsight, I should have made a mould, but I feel like making them by hand is more rewarding and gives each feather a bit of difference between them, which is why in most of my work I usually skip making moulds, as making everything by hand can give a more natural feel. Of course it does depend on what you're making though. There are 3 layers of the longer, bigger feathers which have the bone lines in them, and then a bunch of the tiny ones covering the top, which means I have to make loads of feathers all with different sizes. The size that was easiest and most fun to make were the middle longer feathers on the second row that I make on each wing, as they are small enough that they don't take too much time to make, but are still the long versions, which I think just look nicer overall. It is quite difficult when it comes to, of course, making something that has pretty much no armature in it. These wings were very floppy and I did have to bake them before putting them on, which just meant that it was all over the place. Some feathers bent in weird ways, but in general it looks quite natural I think in the end, but it was definitely difficult trying to get them to look good. After baking it for the first time, I then need to texture the feathers on the back. Of course, because they are delicate and made with Cosclay, I can't texture both sides at the same time, which means that I have to bake it and then do the back side, which I just use a bit of stickier Cosclay using some liquid clay mixed into it, which I stick on the back of each feather and texture it, but I can't put as much detail in. It can't go as deep as the clay is thinner now, because I can only add a thin layer on each side. Because I did make the feathers out of Cosclay, it was very easy to texture the backside, as I could just kind of lift up each feather, texture under it, and then stick them back together afterwards. Then I just need to add the remaining feathers on top before attaching it to the body. It was quite difficult attaching it. I was scared that they were going to fall. At one point, the left wing did fall off. I was sitting there in front of my oven going, one of these are going to fall. I turn around for like maybe 10 seconds, I come back and it's fallen over. I was sitting there for like 10 minutes and then of course the minute I walk away it falls over, so I have to re-bake it with some extra support under it. After the full thing is baked though, I can start painting. Starting with the base, I begin painting just the middle muddy section in this dark brown, but then realised that I wanted the whole thing to be brown. I'll tell you why in a moment when I get onto the grass. In the meantime, I add splotches of lighter browns to the mud so it isn't completely flat all over, but I don't do this for the grassy areas at the sides as it'll be unnecessary for what I'm going to do with it. Painting the stones is simple. It's just grey, lighter grey, and then to top it off, an even lighter grey, making sure to dry brush the lighter shades on top. I didn't do this myself, but it could be a good idea to incorporate some other colours into the greys, like blue, maybe a bit of red or yellow, or maybe a bit of brown in there too. Now back to the grass, I'll tell you why I added brown first. It's so that when I add the green, the brown will be peeking through some areas underneath, making it look more natural. Seems obvious now that I think about it, but I never thought about it before. It's the little things like these that can bring something together better in the painting process, and it really is just about experimenting. I've never done this before, tried it randomly here, and it looks 10 times better than how I've painted grass and ground before. Although I've tweaked that part of the process, the rest stays pretty much the same, starting with a darker green, then going to the lighter ones on top. I do also have to paint those longer strands of grass too, so each one I make sure to switch between the different green shades as I use the paint, so painting random ones in this shade, and then the lighter one after once I've dry brushed the rest of the grassy base. When lightening the greens, I usually use a bit of yellow, but quite a dull yellow, like a yellow ochre, which doesn't dull out the colour like white might do. Now onto the part that you're here for once again, the shoebill. I start with its legs, painting them in a quite similar colour as I did the stones, but with a hint of blue in there, which is a running theme for most of the painting of the shoebill, especially on the feathers. I use a wash of a darker grey to sink into those little crevices before moving onto the feathery body. The thigh area is going to be painted one of the lightest shades on the body, with a very dulled out light blue as the undercoat. I want to get most of the base painting down on this one before I start on any dry brushing, as most of the colours you see, other than the beak, are pretty much the same except for a few different tones of the same colour. I then work on the main body, and getting the paint into all of these little crevices under the feathers is very difficult, which is why after I do this base coat, I will use a much watered down version of this colour to sink into those little crevices. Some areas, like the chest and the back, are a slightly different tone to the rest of the body, a bit darker and a bit more dulled out, just to add a bit of difference in there. If you're trying to make something look natural like this, or as natural as you can get it, adding slightly different tones and colours in there will make it just look a little bit nicer. The colour on the tail is the same colour that will be used on the bottom half of the feathers of the wings, which is quite a darker, more vibrant blue than the other shades, which are a bit more dulled out. As it's the first colour on the wings, I don't really have to worry about going as delicately and not worrying about layering over the feathers on top of them, which is why I start with these feathers as they are underneath the other ones. As if I painted the ones on top first, then getting that paint under the feathers would be quite difficult. Again, as I say in every single video, ordering is important. Then working on the head, I use a very light shade of this blue, one that quite matches the thigh colour as well, just very light overall. It isn't much of a deal that I paint over the cabochons, as the paint can be very easily scraped off of them at the end. Once the paint on the first layer of feathers is dry, I start to dry brush them, starting with a slightly lighter shade, bringing my brush down opposite to the direction that the lines on the feathers are going. Directional dry brushing is important to get your paint to go exactly where you need it. Once this layer is done, I go in with an even lighter colour, only doing one edge of each feather, the one sticking out and not being covered by the next feather along. This just kind of helps separate each of the feathers up and also adds a nice different shade to each of the sides of the feathers. I then got my hands on a new tiny brush and decided to use it to paint the bone lines. If you've ever thought to yourself that having shaky hands is the reason you don't do art or sculpting, just remember, this is art, not brain surgery. There are easy ways to touch up details that your shaky hands might mess up. For example, these lines. They came out messy, but I can just go back and touch it up with the darker blue again later. Another thing you can do to help yourself is to stabilise your hands. I hold one hand with the other and rest them where I can. For example, when doing these lines, I rested my hand on my table, the tail, and it just makes it more stable overall. However, this can be different for everyone depending on where the shakiness is coming from and how bad it is. Is it your fingers, wrists, elbows, shoulder? I don't know. Just take the time to figure out yourself and see what works and how you can help yourself just be a little bit more stable. Me personally, it's in my fingers and wrists. Also, having wetter paints can help you achieve smoother lines overall, as well as a teeny paintbrush like this. The next layer up is going to be a lighter shade of this blue, being one of the tones I used to dry brush on the previous layer. Again, going in after and dry brushing an even lighter colour on, and as this part of the wing is a similar shade to the rest of the body, the colour I used to dry brush this area is the same one I use for everywhere else. These little feathers on the main body are quite difficult to differentiate even with the dry brushing, so I do go in a little delicately and kind of paint the tips of each feather separately. The very top side of the wings is dry brushed an even lighter colour, the same one that I use for the head. You might notice there are some dark spots around the eyes, which is just a wash I use to make this area look a little different, to separate it from the rest of the head and to make it look a bit more evil, which is the same reason as to why I use just that little tinge of brown under the eyes as well. The back of the head is dry brushed an even lighter colour just to separate it that bit further before I move on to the beak. The top of the beak is a kind of lightish yellow, which then blends down into a much darker orange right at the tip, with also a little bit of brown right at the end. To blend them, I do use just a little bit of water and it just blends them nice and smoothly. And as the colour is quite light, I do that on purpose so that when I use this wet wash of a darker brown afterwards, it seeps into those little cracks and crevices and just overall makes the colour just a little bit darker. Remember earlier when I mentioned adding that very faint detail to the beak? This is why. This wash means that all that dark colour seeps gently in and adds these nice dark lines that stray across the beak and overall makes the whole thing a little darker. The last thing I need to do is scrape off that excess paint for the cabochons to reveal those lovely, intimidating eyes. Our handsome Shoebill is complete. Thank you as always for sticking to the end. This one was a pain to make, but I'm glad I stuck through. I mean it when I say there were a few times where I was close to scrapping it. Unfortunately, there are estimated to be only around an average of 4,000 of these beautiful birds left. They are vulnerable, and as they are my favourite big bird, I really wanted to make this video to shed some light on them. There's actually one in the UK, in a zoo a little far from me, but one day I hope to see it. And I hope this video shows some of you a new creature you've never heard of, and hopefully inspires some people to look into them and love them just as much as I do, because they really are something special, just as every other animal is. I think the efforts people are making to show everyone new animals that we may have never even heard of is great. I love seeing something new, and David Attenborough has always been an inspiration in that regard. So I think in the future I might make a series making obscure animals, so let me know if you'd like that. And if you would like to see more like this in the future, a like and maybe even a subscribe would be greatly appreciated. It keeps me fueled seeing that number go up. Usually I'd ask for suggestions, but I'm quite hard stuck on an idea for what I want to do for the next video. So if you have any ideas for the future, then let me know. Have an amazing day everyone, and get to sculpting. Ta-ta!